David, you know New York. We were just talking about this before. So, of course, I'm going to ask you about Zohran Mamdani.
Yes.
And populism from the left context here. We just talked about Donald Trump. I wonder if in some way Mamdani's shock win in the primary is a bookend to the 10 years of Donald Trump coming down the golden escalator in Midtown. And then you have Mamdani almost 10 years to the day later, surprising everybody with something that AOC, and this is bigger than the AOC win because it's citywide. So what did you make? What does that tell us about the Democratic Party from a kind of populist or trajectory of populist lens?
So the first thing I would say is Zohran Mamdani is a very talented politician.
Yeah.
And if there are people who have just heard of him, particularly people who are skeptical of him, I would encourage them, go watch some of his videos. Mm-hmm. Go look at what he's done on Instagram, look at what he's done on other platforms. He is engaging, he's always smiling, he is funny. And I think it's just worth remembering that a significant part of politics is that kind of performance. Mm-hmm. Ronald Reagan was very good at it, Barack Obama is very good at it. That is part of politics, and Zohran Mamdani is very good at it. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that and also to say that the center-left, which was really his main opposition, has two really bad candidates in this race, right? Andrew Cuomo, who has a documented record of sexual harassment, and now Eric Adams, who has a documented record of corruption. And against them, you had Zohran Mamdani, who is this charming and engaging figure. Now, I and my colleagues on the editorial board have deep qualms about his agenda. We are very much worried that if you look at this style of progressive governance that doesn't seem to take the idea of order very seriously, right, and is deeply skeptical of the police and thinks that you can do rent control, you can rent control your way to low housing prices as opposed to actually having to increase the housing supply. That record just hasn't looked very good. New York is a worse place to live by most metrics than when Bill de Blasio, another progressive, became mayor. Chicago is struggling incredibly with their current progressive mayor. Cities on the West Coast like Seattle and San Francisco are looking at some of their progressive policies like we can just let people use drugs and not worry about it and saying that was a mistake. And so I do really have concerns about Mamdani's agenda. Mm-hmm. Now, he has shown some signs that he is willing to listen to criticism and moderate. So I don't know if he wins what kind of mayoralty he would have. In terms of what it says for the Democratic Party, I'm not sure how much it says, to be honest. He won a Democratic primary in New York City. There is still no evidence at all that a candidate like Zohran Mamdani can win tough races in purple states or in congressional districts. None at all. You look at the Democrats who won in places where Donald Trump also won. They didn't run campaigns like Zohran Mamdani. Ruben Gallego, Alyssa Slotkin, True. Jared Golden, Marcy Kaptur, that's not what they sound like. And so I am skeptical that he has somehow unlocked some new formula for winning races that Democrats haven't won before. I do think he's a reminder that political talent and excitement matter.
Although I'm also kind of curious as to, and you'll know way more about this than I do, but the consolidation behind Andrew Cuomo after his pandemic record, not to mention, as you pointed out, his documented record of sexual harassment. I found that to be a very curious decision from sort of the Democratic establishment in New York. It was almost as though there's a blind spot still about how deeply skeptical of the establishment post-COVID, post-Biden, even Democrats are now. I don't know. I'm curious what you think.
I think that's fair. And obviously the kind of the coalescing of the establishment around Cuomo didn't help him win, right? It's not even clear how much it benefited him. Look, I think if you, at the end of the day, if voters are presented with a choice between a candidate whose agenda they like more, but who is a deeply flawed or even a bad person, and a candidate whose agenda they don't like, I think we've seen again and again that most people are often going to choose the person whose agenda they like more. And I think that's what we saw the kind of establishment in New York trying to do with Cuomo. But Cuomo is just such a flawed candidate and ran a flawed campaign that it didn't end up making the difference. I think the thing for the kind of center left to really reflect on is why have they done such a bad job of producing compelling candidates now for roughly a decade? And before that, the center left was great at producing compelling candidates. Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, the most talented Democratic politicians of the last half century, are center left figures. Right? And since then, what we've had is Joe Biden running as an obviously aging candidate who both the center left and the left pretended wasn't aging. We've had Kamala Harris, who is not a good candidate. In New York, we've had Andrew Cuomo. In Congress, we have a parade of people often who are in their 70s or 80s. And so it's been a while since the center left has produced compelling candidates. Now, I think it's possible that the future's different. I already mentioned Alyssa Slotkin. I mentioned Ruben Gallego. Another person who's spoken at this conference is the mayor of Denver, Mike Johnston, who I moderated a panel on immigration with him and Governor Kemp of Georgia. And at the end, Mayor Johnston moved a lot of the audience to tears by telling a story about an immigrant who had enlisted in the U.S. Army to give back to this country that had given him so much. So there are talented figures out there, but at this point, they aren't yet national leaders.
And one of the things you guys have very noticeably been doing on the Times opinion section is bringing in new voices, different voices. And I think that's really, really interesting. And I just am curious for your sense on how, in spaces like this, the sort of center left, upper echelon of media and business, how is that going? Maybe that's the best way to put it. How is that effort to sort of reacquaint ourselves with America in the media? How do you think that's progressing now? Again, 10 years since Donald Trump kind of surprised everyone.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because the leader of New York Times Opinion is Katie Kingsbury, and that is one of the most important things to her. This idea of making sure that Times Opinion is a forum for a wider range of voices. And I think it's fair to be critical of the establishment in general, forums like the Aspen Ideas Festival, and forums like the New York Times Opinion pages, and say, in the past, they weren't sufficiently open to a wide enough range of perspectives. I mean, the Times had no columnist in 2016 who was writing really positively about Bernie Sanders. Right? And so it wasn't just that we weren't publishing enough conservatives, we weren't publishing enough leftists either.
It was also class, right?
It's class as well. We weren't publishing enough heterodox voices. Now, we were publishing a lot of interesting voices, but we could do better, and we can still do better, and we're trying to do better. But just broadening out, too much of our debate has been constrained. It has been, and it's particularly been constrained in elite circles. You and I have talked, Emily, before about immigration, and this sort of idea that for a long time there was this consensus among Democratic elites and Republican elites that more immigration is better. More and more and more is better. And you know what? Most voters didn't feel that way. And the idea that elite politicians essentially decided that they were going to ignore public opinion and do what they preferred, that's a really dangerous thing to do. And I'm not sure Donald Trump could have won the presidency if he didn't, in his own kind of animalistic way, recognize that on both trade and immigration, elites were where the public wasn't. Ross Perot tried that. And if you think about it, Ross Perot does that in the 90s. He's like, we've got too much trade and too much immigration. And how do the parties respond to him basically discovering this, 25% of the electorate that felt really badly served by the parties? The two parties ignored that 25% of the electorate. And it was sitting there waiting for Donald Trump to kind of take over the Republican Party and then add just enough Democrats and independents to allow him to be elected president twice.
And so that cohort was also, I think, by the time Trump comes around, angrier, because there had been an increasing, sense of sort of getting smeared by the people who were ignoring them in Perot times. And then eventually that moved into sort of an ugly culture war clash for, I think, some of the reasons of just our physical geographic separating. People are less intertwined. Our lives are less intertwined on a class basis. And so by the time Trump comes around, you have this really ugly culture war divide, I would say arguably between haves and have-nots. And that's where I want to ask about the immigration panel you did. I thought that was so interesting. You had Brian Kemp, the executive director of the ACLU, Denver's Democratic mayor. And I don't know that conversation could have happened a couple of years ago, David.
That's interesting. I think you might be right about that. I mean, I do think that if you think about a series of issues, definitely immigration, a whole bunch of COVID issues, right? Like, should schools be closed? Should we have mask mandates? Where did the COVID virus start?
Right.
You think about other hot button issues on gender. And I do think that we went through a period where you would have a debate and it wasn't just I disagree with you, but there were a set of views, particularly among elite progressives, in which it was like, if you have the view that I don't have, you're some version of ignorant or bigoted, or in the case of COVID, you don't care about people dying. And that's just not a good way to have political debates.